"I won't take your charity, Mr. Donovan." Sarah's voice trembled with exhaustion, but her chin lifted with that familiar defiance that had first captured his heart. Her worn calico dress hung loose on her thin frame, and the shadows under her green eyes spoke of sleepless nights and empty meals. Jacob's weathered hands stilled on the deed he'd been extending toward her. The parchment crinkled in the silence of his ranch office, while outside the October wind howled across the Montana plains. 3 months they'd been married now, 3 months since that desperate day at Henley's bakery, and still she flinched away from his kindness like a wild mustang refusing the bridle. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel. Give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. Sarah, this ain't charity. This here's your name on the deed. You're my wife. His voice carried that familiar gruff tenderness that made her heart ache in ways she couldn't afford. A wife you bought with a loaf of bread and $50. The words tasted bitter on her tongue, but she couldn't take them back. Couldn't take back the truth that lay between them like a chasm neither dared cross. Jacob's blue eyes darkened and something dangerous flickered there. Hurt, maybe, or anger. She'd pushed too far this time. The golden afternoon light streaming through the window caught the silver threads in his dark hair, reminding her that Jacob Donovan was no ordinary ranch hand but one of the wealthiest cattlemen in 3 counties. A man who could have any woman he wanted. That what you think this is? His voice dropped to a whisper that sent shivers down her spine. That I bought you? The deed fluttered to the floor between them, forgotten. Outside, hoofbeats thundered into the yard. Too many horses, coming too fast. Sarah's blood turned to ice water. She'd hoped they'd never find her here, hidden away on Jacob's remote ranch. She'd hoped Thomas Garrett would tire of hunting her down. She'd been wrong. Jacob's hand moved instinctively toward his gun belt as male voices shouted orders in the yard. Through the window, Sarah caught sight of the star pinned to the lead rider's vest, and her world tilted sideways. "Mrs. Sarah Garrett," the sheriff called out, his voice carrying clearly through the walls. "You're under arrest for the murder of your husband." The color drained from Jacob's face as he looked at her, really looked at her, and Sarah saw the exact moment when everything changed between them. Let me take you back to where this all began, because sometimes love starts in the most desperate places imaginable. It was a Tuesday morning in early July when Jacob Donovan first laid eyes on Sarah McKenna, though he didn't know her name then. He'd ridden into Copper Falls for supplies, his saddlebags heavy with silver dollars, and his mind occupied with thoughts of expanding his herd before winter set in. The Montana sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street, and the wooden sidewalks creaked under the weight of cowboys and townspeople going about their business. Jacob had just finished loading barbed wire onto his wagon when he heard it. A woman's voice, soft but desperate, drifting from Henley's bakery across the street. "Please, Mr. Henley, just 1 loaf. I can pay." There was pride in those words, but underneath it, Jacob heard something that made his chest tighten. Hunger. Being a man who minded his own business, Jacob should have climbed onto his wagon and headed home to his ranch. Should have, but didn't. Something in that voice called to him like a song he'd forgotten he knew. He tied his horse to the hitching post and stepped into the bakery's shade. The scent of fresh bread and cinnamon filled the air, making his stomach rumble despite the hearty breakfast he'd consumed hours earlier. Behind the counter, old Henley stood with his arms crossed, his face set in stubborn lines that Jacob recognized all too well. The woman stood with her back to the door, but Jacob could see everything he needed to know in the proud set of her shoulders and the careful way she counted coins from a small cloth purse. Her dress was clean but faded, the kind of calico that had seen too many washings and too many mended tears. Dark brown hair, pinned up neat despite the heat, revealed the elegant curve of her neck. "1 penny, Henley was saying, his voice loud enough to carry. "You're 1 penny short, and I won't be giving bread away to every beggar that wanders in here." The woman's shoulders stiffened. "I'm not a beggar, sir. I'm simply 1 penny short." Jacob's jaw clenched. He'd known Henley for 10 years, had bought countless supplies from the man's store, and had always found him fair in his dealings. But there was something in the baker's tone, a cruelty that set Jacob's teeth on edge. "Short is short," Henley continued. "Come back when you have proper payment." The woman carefully placed her coins back in the purse, each movement precise and controlled. Jacob could see her hands trembling slightly, though whether from hunger or humiliation, he couldn't say. "Of course. Thank you for your time." Her voice remained steady, dignified even in defeat. She turned toward the door, and Jacob got his first clear look at her face. Green eyes dominated features that were fine-boned and delicate, though hollowed by hunger and whatever troubles had brought her to this point. She was young, younger than his 35 years, but there was an old pain in her eyes that spoke of losses he could only imagine. Their gazes met for just a moment as she passed, and Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, like the earth moving beneath his feet. She was beautiful, yes, but it wasn't her beauty that stopped his breath. It was the dignity she wore like armor, the way she held her head high despite her circumstances. It was the recognition that here was a woman who'd been dealt a hard hand but refused to fold. Without conscious thought, Jacob reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a silver dollar. "Henley," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, "give the lady her bread." The woman froze in the doorway but didn't turn around. "And throw in some of those cinnamon rolls while you're at it." Now she did turn, her green eyes flashing with something between gratitude and anger. "I don't need your charity, sir." "Ain't charity," Jacob replied quietly. "Call it an investment." She studied his face for a long moment, and Jacob found himself holding his breath, waiting for her decision. What happened next would change both their lives forever, though neither of them knew it at the time. "An investment in what?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. She'd learned long ago to be wary of men bearing gifts, especially men who looked like this one, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands that spoke of honest work and eyes the color of winter sky. Jacob found himself studying her face, noting the intelligence there, the wariness of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. "In doing what's right," he said simply. Behind the counter, Henley shifted impatiently. "Mr. Donovan, if you're buying, I'll wrap it up. If not—" "Wrap it," Jacob said without taking his eyes off the woman, "and add some of that cheese and jerky. Make it a good meal." Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "I cannot accept." "You can and you will." Jacob's tone brooked no argument. A woman shouldn't go hungry while good men stand by and watch. The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning neither of them was ready to examine too closely. Sarah's pride warred with her empty stomach and the very real prospect of another night without food. "I'll repay you," she said finally. "No need. There's every need." Her chin lifted again, and Jacob felt that now familiar tug in his chest. "I'm Sarah McKenna, and I pay my debts." Jacob Donovan. He touched the brim of his hat. "And I wasn't expecting repayment." Henley slapped the wrapped bundle onto the counter with unnecessary force. "$1.50, he announced. Jacob placed $2 on the counter without hesitation. "Keep the change for your troubles." The baker's attitude shifted immediately. "Much obliged, Mr. Donovan. Always a pleasure doing business with you." Sarah accepted the bundle with hands that barely trembled, though Jacob could see the effort it cost her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Both of you." As she moved toward the door again, Jacob found himself following. He couldn't have said why. He'd done his good deed for the day, helped a stranger in need. There was no reason to pursue it further, except for the way she'd looked at him, like she was trying to solve a puzzle, except for the pride in her voice when she'd given her name, except for the growing certainty that letting her walk away would be the biggest mistake of his life. "Mrs. McKenna," he called as she reached the sidewalk. She paused, turning back with questions in her green eyes. "You said you pay your debts. I might have some work that needs doing if you're interested." A shadow crossed her face. "What kind of work?" Jacob hadn't thought that far ahead. His ranch hands kept his house clean enough, and he took most of his meals in the bunkhouse with the men. But looking at this woman, this Sarah McKenna, he found himself improvising. "Cooking, cleaning, general housekeeping. My place could use a woman's touch." The words sounded reasonable enough, though they both knew it was more complicated than that. "I see." Sarah's voice had gone carefully neutral again. "And what would such work pay?" "Room and board, plus $20 a month." The amount was generous, more than generous, and they both knew it. "That's very kind, Mr. Donovan, but I'm not sure it would be appropriate. A single woman living in a man's house." Jacob felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I've got a guest cabin that's empty. You'd have your own place, your privacy. Nothing improper about it." Sarah studied his face for a long moment, clearly weighing her options. Jacob waited, acutely aware that his heart was beating faster than it had any right to. "May I ask why you're making this offer? You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," Jacob said quietly. "I know you're honest. You tried to pay for that bread when you could have just walked out. I know you're proud. You're standing here talking to me instead of running away with my charity. And I know you're in trouble, though I don't need to know the details." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Sarah McKenna looked down at the bundle in her hands, then back at Jacob's face. "If I were to accept such an arrangement, it would be strictly business. I would earn my keep and maintain my independence. Wouldn't expect anything else. And if the situation became uncomfortable, I would be free to leave at any time." "Course you would." She was quiet for so long that Jacob began to think she'd refuse. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she said, "When would you need me to start?" Something dangerous flickered in Jacob's chest, something that felt suspiciously like hope. The ride to Jacob's ranch stretched 15 miles through some of the most beautiful and unforgiving country Sarah had ever seen. She rode beside him in the wagon, acutely aware of his presence in a way that made her uncomfortably warm despite the afternoon breeze. Jacob Donovan was not a talkative man, but his silence felt companionable rather than hostile, and she found herself stealing glances at his profile as he guided the horses along the rutted road. The Montana landscape rolled away in all directions, endless golden grassland dotted with cattle, all stretching toward mountains that rose like ancient sentinels against the summer sky. It was beautiful and intimidating in equal measure, reminding Sarah just how far she was from everything she'd once known. "Been ranching here long?" she asked, more to break the silence than from any real curiosity. "Going on 15 years now," Jacob replied, his voice rumbling like distant thunder. "Started with nothing but 100 head of cattle and more ambition than sense. And now I've got more cattle than I can count, and enough sense to know I'm lucky." He glanced at her sideways. "What about you? You're not from around here." Sarah's hands tightened on the bundle in her lap. "Ohio, originally. My husband and I came west last spring." The lie came easily. She'd practiced it enough times. "He died of fever in Denver. I've been managing since then." The words were close enough to the truth to sound convincing, she hoped. William had died, though not of fever and not in Denver. And she had been managing, though managing was a generous term for what the past 3 months had looked like. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jacob said quietly, and something in his tone told her he understood loss in ways that went deeper than mere politeness. "Thank you." Sarah kept her voice steady with effort. "It's been difficult." They rode in comfortable silence after that, both lost in their own thoughts. Sarah found herself studying the landscape with new eyes, trying to imagine herself here, in this vast emptiness. It was so different from the green hills of Ohio, from the neat towns and familiar faces she'd grown up with. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jacob pointed ahead to where a cluster of buildings sat in a valley protected by rolling hills. "There she is," he said, and Sarah heard pride in his voice. "The Lazy D Ranch." Sarah's breath caught. She'd expected a simple homestead, maybe a cabin and a barn. What she saw was practically a small town, a sprawling ranch house with a wide front porch, several outbuildings including what looked like a blacksmith shop, corrals filled with horses, and a bunkhouse that could house a dozen men or more. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, unable to hide her amazement. "With help," Jacob admitted. "Good men who believed in what we were building here." As they approached the main house, several cowboys emerged from various buildings to watch their arrival. Sarah felt their curious stares and lifted her chin, determined not to show how intimidated she felt. Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, then moved around to help her. His hands were warm and calloused as he lifted her to the ground, and Sarah found herself looking up into his blue eyes for a moment longer than was proper. "Boys," Jacob called to the watching men, "this is Mrs. McKenna. She'll be helping with the housekeeping." The cowboys touched their hats respectfully, though Sarah caught the speculative looks that passed between them. She couldn't blame them for wondering. A single woman arriving out of nowhere to work for their boss was bound to cause talk. "Tom," Jacob continued, addressing a grizzled older man who seemed to be the foreman, "would you show Mrs. McKenna to the guest cabin? Make sure she has everything she needs." "Sure thing, boss." Tom stepped forward with a gap-toothed grin. "Ma'am, if you'll follow me." The guest cabin sat about 50 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience but far enough for propriety. It was small but well built, with a stone fireplace, a comfortable bed, and windows that looked out over the valley. "Mr. Donovan had us clean it up when he heard you'd be coming," Tom explained as he set her small bag on the table. "If you need anything else, just holler." After Tom left, Sarah stood in the middle of her new home and tried to process what had happened. This morning she'd been facing another hungry day in Copper Falls, and now she was standing in a comfortable cabin on one of the largest ranches in Montana. She moved to the window and looked out at the ranch buildings, where she could see Jacob unsaddling his horse. Even from this distance, she could see the easy competence in his movements, the way the other men deferred to him without question. What had she gotten herself into? A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Jacob standing on her small porch, his hat in his hands. "Thought you might like to know about meals," he said. "Cookie serves breakfast at dawn, lunch at noon, and supper at 6. You're welcome to eat with the men in the bunkhouse, or I can have something sent over." "I'll eat with the men," Sarah said quickly. I don't want to be any trouble. Jacob studied her face. It's no trouble, but suit yourself. He paused, then added, There's a bell that rings for meals. You'll hear it. Thank you. Sarah hesitated, then asked, What exactly will my duties be? Whatever needs doing, Jacob said simply. The main house could use a good cleaning, and I'd appreciate having someone who can cook something besides beans and hardtack. I can cook, Sarah said, thinking of the skills her mother had drilled into her during what felt like another lifetime. Good. Jacob settled his hat back on his head. We'll start tomorrow. Tonight, just rest. As he turned to go, Sarah found herself calling after him. Mr. Donovan? He paused, looking back. Why did you really offer me this job? Jacob was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd heard it before. Because sometimes we all need a second chance, Mrs. McKenna, and because I recognize someone who's running from something. The words hit too close to home, but before Sarah could respond, Jacob touched his hat and walked away, leaving her alone with questions she wasn't ready to answer. The morning bell woke Sarah before dawn, its clanging echoing across the valley like a call to battle. She dressed quickly in her one clean dress and braided her hair back in a practical style before making her way to the bunkhouse. The air was crisp and cold, with that high country bite that reminded her how far north she'd traveled. Stars still glittered overhead, though the eastern horizon showed the first pale hint of sunrise. The bunkhouse was warm and noisy, filled with the sounds of men preparing for another day's work. Conversations died as Sarah entered, but Tom quickly stepped forward to guide her to a seat at the long table. Boys, mind your manners, he announced. We got a lady present. The cowboys touched their hats and murmured polite greetings, though Sarah could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. She kept her eyes on her plate as Cookie, a weathered man with kind eyes and arms like tree trunks, served her bacon, eggs, and biscuits that smelled like heaven. Jacob entered just as she was finishing her meal, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken despite herself. He looked different in the morning light, more at ease, more in his element. This was clearly a man who belonged to this land as surely as the mountains belonged to the sky. Mrs. McKenna, he said, touching his hat. Ready to see the main house? Sarah nodded and followed him outside, leaving behind the comfortable chatter of the bunkhouse. The ranch was coming alive around them. Men heading to the corrals, horses being saddled, the sounds of animals being fed and watered. The main house was impressive up close, built of logs and stone with wide windows and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Jacob opened the front door and gestured her inside. Lord have mercy, Sarah breathed. The interior was spacious and well-appointed, with furniture that spoke of money and taste. But it was also clearly the home of a man living alone. Dust lay thick on every surface. Dirty dishes sat abandoned in the kitchen, and clothes were scattered across chairs like fallen leaves. I told you it needed work, Jacob said, sounding almost embarrassed. Sarah moved through the rooms, taking inventory. The parlor needed a thorough cleaning and airing out. The kitchen was well equipped, but filthy. The bedrooms upstairs were dusty and neglected, though she noticed that Jacob's room was tidier than the rest. The bed made, clothes hung properly. When did you last have help with the house? She asked. My wife used to... Jacob's voice trailed off, and something painful flickered across his face. It's been a while. Sarah felt a stab of something she couldn't quite name. Sympathy, certainly, but underneath that was something more complicated, something that felt dangerously like jealousy. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I didn't know you'd been married. 3 years ago, fever took her. Jacob's voice was matter-of-fact, but Sarah could hear the old pain underneath. Haven't seen much point in keeping house since then. The admission hung between them, heavy with unspoken grief. Sarah understood that kind of loss, the way it could hollow out your chest and leave you wondering how to keep breathing. "Well," she said briskly, pushing aside her own memories, "we'll have this place right as rain in no time." Jacob looked at her with something that might have been gratitude. "I'll leave you to it then. If you need anything, just ask Tom." After he left, Sarah stood in the middle of the parlor and surveyed her new domain. It was overwhelming, certainly, but also oddly comforting. She'd always found peace in hard work, in the rhythm of cleaning and organizing. It was something she could control when everything else felt chaotic. She started with the kitchen, reasoning that a clean place to cook was essential. As she worked, scrubbing and organizing, she found herself thinking about Jacob's wife. Had she been beautiful? Had she loved this house, this land? Had Jacob looked at her the way he'd looked at Sarah yesterday, with that mixture of protectiveness and something deeper? The thought made her uncomfortable in ways she didn't want to examine. By noon, she'd made significant progress. The kitchen was spotless, the parlor dusted and swept, and she'd started a load of laundry in the wash house out back. When the bell rang for lunch, she realized she was genuinely hungry. Not the desperate hunger of recent weeks, but the good, tired hunger of honest work. She was hanging clothes on the line when Jacob appeared beside her, startling her into nearly dropping a wet shirt. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to spook you." "It's fine." Sarah pinned the shirt to the line with unnecessary concentration. "I was just thinking. House looks good already. You work fast. I like to stay busy." The words came out more sharply than she'd intended, and Jacob's eyebrows rose slightly. "Nothing wrong with that." He paused, then asked, "You mind if I ask what you're running from?" The question hit like a physical blow. Sarah's hands stilled on the clothesline, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. "I don't know what you mean," she said carefully. "Course you do." Jacob's voice was gentle but implacable. A woman doesn't end up in Copper Falls with 1 penny to her name unless she's running from something. Question is whether it's something that's going to follow you here. Sarah turned to face him, and the understanding in his blue eyes nearly undid her completely. The truth was a living thing inside Sarah's chest, clawing to get out. But she'd learned long ago that the truth was a luxury she couldn't afford. "We all have things we'd rather leave behind, Mr. Donovan," she said carefully, meeting his gaze despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. Jacob studied her face for a long moment, and Sarah had the uncomfortable feeling that he could see straight through her carefully constructed lies. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she'd expected. "That we do," he agreed. "But some things have a way of catching up, no matter how far we run." The words sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she kept her expression neutral. "Are you having second thoughts about hiring me?" "No." The answer came without hesitation. "But I need to know if I should be watching the road for trouble." Sarah considered lying again, but something in Jacob's steady gaze made her reconsider. This man had shown her kindness when she desperately needed it, had offered her shelter and honest work. He deserved some version of the truth, even if she couldn't give him all of it. "My husband had debts," she said finally, each word carefully chosen. "When he died, certain people thought I should be responsible for paying them. I disagreed." It wasn't entirely a lie. William had indeed had debts, to his brother, to his drinking companions, to the saloon girls who'd claimed his attention and his money. What she didn't mention was that the debt she was running from wasn't financial. Jacob nodded slowly. "How much debt?" "Enough that they'd follow me if they knew where to look." "And if they find you here?" Sarah's throat tightened. "Then you'd be wise to send me away." "That's not what I asked." The steadiness in his voice undid something inside her. When was the last time someone had stood their ground for her, had refused to be put off by her attempts to protect them? "They'd try to take me back," she whispered, "by force if necessary." Jacob's jaw tightened, and something dangerous flickered in his blue eyes. "Over my dead body." The words were spoken quietly, but with such conviction that Sarah felt them like a physical blow. No one had ever stood between her and danger before. She'd learned to rely on herself, to trust only her own strength and cunning. "You don't understand," she began, but Jacob cut her off. "I understand plenty. I understand that you're scared, and I understand that you're alone. What I don't understand is why you think I'd let anyone hurt you while you're under my protection. You barely know me." "I know enough." Jacob stepped closer, and Sarah caught the scent of leather and horses and something uniquely masculine that made her pulse flutter. "I know you're honest and hardworking. I know you've got more pride than sense and more courage than luck. And I know that whatever you're running from, you don't deserve to be hunted like some kind of animal." Tears burned behind Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She couldn't afford to be weak, couldn't afford to let down her guard just because this man spoke to her with kindness. "Why?" she asked, the word barely audible. "Why would you risk trouble for a stranger?" Jacob was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. "Because 3 years ago, I failed to protect someone I cared about. Because I stood by and watched fever take my wife when I should have done something, anything, to save her. Because maybe if I can keep you safe, it'll balance the scales somehow." The raw honesty in his admission left Sarah breathless. She could see the guilt he carried, the weight of responsibility that sat on his shoulders like a stone. "That wasn't your fault," she said softly. "Wasn't it?" Jacob's smile was bitter. "I had all the money in the world, all the power and influence a man could want, and I couldn't save the one person who mattered most. Some things can't be fought with money or influence." "No, but some things can." Jacob's eyes met hers, and Sarah saw determination there that made her pulse race. "Whatever's chasing you, Mrs. McKenna, we can face it together. You don't have to run anymore." The words were like a song she'd forgotten she knew, a promise of safety and belonging that she'd stopped believing in long ago. For just a moment, she let herself imagine what it would be like to stop running, to stand still long enough to build something real. Then reality crashed back in, cold and unforgiving. "You don't know what you're saying," she whispered. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Jacob's voice was steady, implacable. "Whatever brought you here, whatever you're afraid of, it ends now. This is your home for as long as you want it to be." Home. The word hit Sarah like a physical blow, bringing with it a rush of longing so intense it nearly drove her to her knees. When was the last time she'd had a home? When was the last time she'd felt safe enough to sleep through the night without one eye open? "I should finish the laundry," she said, turning back to the clothesline with hands that trembled slightly. Jacob watched her for a moment longer, then touched his hat. "Think about what I said, Mrs. McKenna. You don't have to carry your burdens alone anymore." As he walked away, Sarah gripped the wet cloth in her hands until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to believe him. God, how she wanted to believe that she could stop running, could trust someone else to help her fight her battles. But Thomas Garrett was still out there somewhere, still hunting her with the single-minded determination of a man who'd never been denied anything he wanted. And what Thomas wanted was her, alive, unharmed, and completely under his control. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and careful conversation, and Sarah began to understand why Jacob's ranch hands followed him with such loyalty. He was everywhere, in the corral breaking horses, in the barn helping with difficult births, in the fields checking fences and cattle. But he was also in the kitchen at dawn, quietly making coffee while she prepared breakfast, and on the porch at sunset, watching the mountains turn purple in the dying light. They'd developed an easy routine that felt dangerously like domesticity. Sarah would rise before Dad to start breakfast, and Jacob would appear just as the coffee finished brewing. They'd eat together in comfortable silence before he headed out with his men, and she turned her attention to the endless tasks of keeping house. The main house had been transformed under her care. Windows sparkled, floors gleamed, and the scent of lemon oil and fresh bread had replaced the stale air of neglect. She'd mended curtains, organized closets, and even coaxed the neglected garden back to life. But it was the small moments that undid her, the way Jacob's eyes lit up when he tasted her apple pie, the careful distance he maintained to preserve her reputation, the respectful way he knocked on her cabin door each evening to check that she had everything she needed. "You're settling in well," Tom observed one afternoon as they watched Jacob working with a particularly spirited stallion in the main corral. Sarah paused in hanging laundry to follow his gaze. Jacob moved with the horse like he was dancing, patient but firm, reading the animal's body language with an expertise that spoke of years of experience. "It's good work," she replied carefully. Tom chuckled. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm saying what any fool with eyes can see. That man's been half alive since he lost Margaret, and you've got him breathing again." The words hit closer to home than Sarah cared to admit. She'd noticed the changes too, the way Jacob lingered over meals now, the way he found excuses to check on her progress with the house, the way his rare smiles came easier when she was around. "Mr. Donovan is my employer, nothing more," she said firmly. "If you say so." Tom's grin suggested he didn't believe a word of it. "Just thought you should know. The boss ain't the kind of man who opens his heart easy. Took him near 2 years to even court Margaret, and she was the prettiest girl in 3 counties. "Tell me about her," Sarah found herself asking before she could stop the words. Tom's expression softened. "Margaret? Sweet as honey and twice as stubborn as the boss when she set her mind to something. Loved this ranch almost as much as she loved Jacob. They were planning to fill this house with children, build something that would last generations." The image painted by Tom's words made Sarah's chest ache with an emotion she didn't want to examine. She could picture it. Jacob with children on his lap, Margaret bustling around the kitchen she'd so carefully cleaned, laughter echoing through rooms that now stood silent. "He must miss her terribly," Sarah said quietly. "He did," Tom agreed. "But lately—" He studied Sarah's face with knowing eyes. "Lately, he's been looking toward the future instead of living in the past." That evening, as Sarah prepared supper in the main house kitchen, she found herself thinking about Tom's words. Was it true? Had she somehow helped Jacob begin to heal from his grief? The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. She had no right to want a place in his life, no right to imagine a future that could never be. Thomas Garrett was still out there, still searching, and when he found her, when, not if, Jacob would learn the truth about what she'd done. She was so lost in her troubled thoughts that she didn't hear Jacob's footsteps until he was standing in the kitchen doorway. "Smells good in here," he said, and his voice was warmer than usual. Sarah looked up from the stew she'd been stirring to find him watching her with an expression that made her pulse flutter. He'd cleaned up from the day's work, his hair damp from washing and his shirt fresh. But it was the look in his blue eyes that undid her, a mixture of appreciation and something deeper that she didn't dare name. "Just beef stew," she said, turning back to the pot to hide her blush. "Best beef stew I've ever tasted," Jacob replied, moving to stand beside her at the stove. "You've got a gift, Sarah." The use of her first name sent warmth spiraling through her chest. Over the past weeks, they'd gradually abandoned the formal Mr. Donovan and Mrs. McKenna, but hearing her name on his lips still affected her more than it should. "My mother's recipe," she said, acutely aware of his proximity. "She teach you to cook?" "She taught me everything. How to keep house, how to tend the sick, how to make a home for—" Sarah's voice trailed off as she realized what she'd almost said. "For a husband," Jacob finished quietly. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "She sounds like a good woman." She was. Sarah stirred the stew with unnecessary vigor. "She died when I was 16. Consumption." "I'm sorry." The sympathy in his voice nearly broke her. She always said that a woman's greatest strength was making a house into a home, making people feel like they belonged somewhere. "You've done that here," Jacob said softly. Sarah's hand stilled on the spoon. "Have I?" "You know you have." Jacob's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "Question is, do you feel like you belong here too?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross, and Sarah found herself balanced on the edge of a precipice she'd sworn she'd never approach again. The honest answer to Jacob's question terrified Sarah more than all of Thomas Garrett's threats combined. "I should check on the biscuits," she said, stepping away from the stove and breaking the spell that had settled between them. But Jacob didn't move, and when she opened the oven door, she could feel his gaze on her like a physical touch. The biscuits were golden and perfect, giving her an excuse to bustle around the kitchen and avoid the conversation that hung unfinished in the air. "Sarah." His voice was patient but determined. "The table needs setting," she said without looking at him. "Sarah." This time there was something in his tone that made her still, made her turn to face him despite every instinct screaming at her to run. Jacob stood in the middle of her kitchen, and when had she started thinking of it as hers? With his hat in his hands and an expression of such gentle determination that it stole her breath. "You can't keep running forever," he said quietly. "I'm not running. I'm setting the table." A smile tugged at the corner of Jacob's mouth. "That's not what I meant, and you know it." Sarah clutched the stack of plates against her chest like armor. "Mr. Donovan." "Jacob. My name is Jacob, and you know it as well as I do." The gentle correction made her chest tight. "This is dangerous territory we're walking into." "Maybe, but I'm tired of pretending I don't feel what I feel when I look at you." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. She'd known, of course, had seen the way his eyes lingered on her face, had felt the electricity when their hands accidentally touched, had noticed how he found excuses to be near her. But hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that terrified her. "You don't know me," she whispered. "You don't know what I've done." "I know enough." Jacob took a step closer, and Sarah could smell the scent of soap and leather that she'd come to associate with safety. "I know you're kind to the hands even when they track mud through your clean kitchen. I know you work harder than any two people I've ever met. I know you sing while you cook, and you think no one can hear you. But I listen from the porch sometimes because it's the most beautiful sound I've ever heard." Sarah's vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. "Jacob, please. I know you check on the sick cattle when you think no one's watching, and I know you've been mending the men's clothes without being asked. I know you read books by lamplight in your cabin, and I know you watch the sunset from your window every evening like you're memorizing it." Each observation felt like a caress, like he was cataloging the pieces of herself she'd thought were hidden. How long had he been watching her? How long had he been seeing things she'd tried to keep private? "I know you're afraid," Jacob continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And I know you've been hurt. But I also know that you make this house feel like a home again. And I know that when you smile, really smile, not that polite one you give the hands, it's like the sun coming out after a storm." "Stop," Sarah breathed, but there was no force behind the word. "And I know," Jacob said, taking another step closer, "that whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it doesn't change how I feel about you." The plates slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers, clattering to the floor in a cascade of broken china. But neither of them looked down. Neither of them moved to clean up the mess. "How do you feel about me?" The question escaped before Sarah could stop it. Jacob's eyes were so blue they looked like pieces of sky. "Like I've been sleepwalking for 3 years, and you woke me up. Like this house has been a tomb, and you brought it back to life. Like maybe I could have a future again, if you were part of it." Sarah's breath caught. "Jacob, I'm not asking for promises," he said quickly, reading the panic in her eyes. "I'm not asking you to love me back. I'm just asking you to stay, to stop looking at the horizon like you're planning your escape route, to give whatever this is between us a chance to grow." The temptation was so strong it made her dizzy. To stay, to stop running, to let herself care about this man who looked at her like she was something precious instead of something to be owned. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I can't. There are things about my past." "I don't care." The simple declaration stopped her cold. "I don't care what you've done or what you think you've done, Jay," Akab continued. "I care about who you are now. In this moment, in this place. I care about the woman who's been taking care of my home and my men like they're her own family. I care about the woman who hums while she works and leaves wildflowers on Margaret's grave when she thinks no one will notice." Sarah's hand flew to her mouth. She'd thought she'd been so careful, had waited until the ranch was asleep before making those quiet visits to the small cemetery on the hill. She'd felt compelled to pay her respects to the woman who'd loved this place before her, had found strange comfort in tending the wild flowers that grew around the simple headstone. "You knew?" "I've known since the first time you did it." Jacob's voice was infinitely gentle. "And it was then that I knew for certain that you were the kind of woman Margaret would have liked, the kind of woman she would have wanted me to find." The tears Sarah had been fighting finally spilled over, running hot down her cheeks. "You're making this impossible." "Good," Jacob said, reaching up to gently wipe away her tears with calloused thumbs, "because losing you would be impossible too." His touch was reverent, careful, as if she were made of spun glass. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself lean into his hands for just a moment, let herself pretend that she was the kind of woman who deserved such tenderness. But reality was a cruel master, and it chose that moment to intrude. The sound of hoofbeats in the yard made them both freeze, made Sarah's eyes snap open with the wild panic of a cornered animal. The riders came hard and fast, their horses' hooves thundering against the packed earth like harbingers of doom. Sarah's blood turned to ice water as she recognized the lead rider's silhouette against the dying light. Even before she could make out his face, she knew that elegant posture, that arrogant set of shoulders that spoke of a man who'd never been told no. Thomas Garrett had found her. "Sarah?" Jacob's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Sarah, what is it?" She couldn't answer, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch through the kitchen window as her worst nightmare dismounted in Jacob's yard with the casual confidence of a man who'd already won. "He's here," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Who's here?" Jacob moved to the window, and his entire body went rigid when he saw the three men approaching the house. Even without knowing the details, he could read danger in their bearing, in the way they spread out like predators surrounding prey. "Thomas Garrett," Sarah said, and saying his name aloud felt like summoning a demon. My late husband's brother." "The debt collector." Jacob's voice had gone cold and hard. "He's more than that." Sarah's hands shook as she backed away from the window. "So much more than that." A sharp knock rattled the front door, followed immediately by a voice that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Mrs. Garrett, I know you're in there. Time to come home, darling." Jacob's jaw clenched at the endearment, and something dangerous flickered in his blue eyes. "Stay here," he ordered quietly. "No." Sarah grabbed his arm. "You don't understand. He's not just some debt collector. Thomas is—" "I don't care what he is." Jacob's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "This is my house, my land, and you're under my protection. Jacob, please, you don't know what he's capable of." But Jacob was already striding toward the front door, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. Sarah followed despite her terror, knowing that whatever happened next would determine the course of the rest of her life. Jacob opened the door with the calm confidence of a man on his own land facing uninvited guests. Thomas Garrett stood on the porch like he owned it, flanked by two men who had the look of hired guns about them. Up close, Thomas was exactly as Sarah remembered, tall and lean, with dark hair going silver at the temples and eyes like winter frost. He was handsome in the way that money and breeding made men handsome, but there was something cold and reptilian in his pale gaze that made her soul recoil. "Mr. Donovan, I presume," Thomas said, touching the brim of his expensive hat. "Thomas Garrett. I believe you have something that belongs to me." "I don't believe I do," Jacob replied evenly. Thomas's smile was sharp as a blade. "Oh, but you do. You see, my dear sister-in-law seems to have gotten confused about where she belongs. Sarah, darling, come out here so we can discuss this like civilized people." Sarah stepped into view, and Thomas's eyes lit up with triumph and something darker that made her stomach turn. "There she is," he said, his voice warm with false affection. "I've been so worried about you, dear, running off like that, all alone in the world. It's not safe for a woman to travel unescorted." "I'm perfectly safe here," Sarah said, proud that her voice barely trembled. "Are you?" Thomas's gaze swept over Jacob with calculated dismissal. "With this rancher?" "Sarah, darling, you're William's widow. That makes you family, and family belongs together." "My husband is dead," Sarah said firmly. "I owe you nothing." Thomas's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the cold fury beneath. "You owe me everything. William died owing me a considerable sum of money, and as his widow, that debt transfers to you." "That's not how the law works," Jacob interjected. "Isn't it?" Thomas pulled a folded paper from his jacket. "This here's a promissory note, signed by William Garrett, guaranteeing repayment with his life or his wife's service as collateral. Perfectly legal, witnessed and notarized." Sarah's vision blurred as she looked at the document. She'd never seen it before, but she recognized William's handwriting, his signature. What had he gotten himself into? What promises had he made on her behalf while she'd been tending his sickbed? "Let me see that," Jacob said, holding out his hand. Thomas hesitated, then handed over the paper with obvious reluctance. Jacob read it carefully, his expression growing darker with each line. "This is unconscionable," he said finally. "No court would uphold." "Wouldn't they?" Thomas's smile was poison-sweet. "I have excellent lawyers, Mr. Donovan, and I have patience. I can make this very difficult for everyone involved, or Sarah can simply come home with me tonight and we can settle this privately." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah knew what settling privately meant, had seen the way Thomas looked at her even when William was alive. She'd rather die than go anywhere with him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, moving closer to Jacob. "Oh, but you are." Thomas's voice hardened. "One way or another, the easy way or the hard way, your choice." Jacob stepped forward, putting himself between Sarah and Thomas. "The lady said no. That means you're done here." Thomas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think you can fight me, cowboy? I have lawyers, judges, politicians in my pocket. I can make one woman disappear and no one will ever ask questions." "Maybe," Jacob said quietly. "But first you'll have to go through me." The words were spoken softly, but there was such deadly promise in them that Thomas's hired guns shifted nervously. Sarah could see Jacob's hand hovering near his gun, could see the coiled tension in his shoulders. "How romantic," Thomas sneered. "The gallant rancher defending the poor widow's honor. Tell me, Mr. Donovan, are you prepared to die for her? Are you prepared to find out?" Jacob's voice was calm as still water, but Sarah could hear the steel beneath. The standoff stretched like a bowstring pulled too tight, and Sarah could feel violence gathering in the air like storm clouds. Thomas studied Jacob with the calculating gaze of a man weighing his options. Behind him, his hired guns waited for orders, hands hovering near their weapons with professional readiness. "You're making a mistake, Donovan," Thomas said finally. "I'm offering you a chance to walk away from this cleanly. Don't let your attachment to my sister-in-law cloud your judgment." "My judgment's plenty clear," Jacob replied. "You're trespassing on my land, threatening a woman under my protection. That makes this real simple." "Does it?" Thomas's smile was cold as winter wind. "Even when I tell you what your precious Sarah really is, what she's done?" Sarah's heart stopped. She'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it more than any physical threat Thomas might make. The truth was a weapon he'd been saving for this exact moment. "Whatever you think you know," she began, but Thomas cut her off. "Oh, I don't think, darling. I know. I know that my dear brother William didn't die of fever in Denver. I know he died in our family home in Chicago, with a bullet in his chest. I know that the last person to see him alive was his loving wife." The words hit Jacob like physical blows. Sarah saw him stiffen, saw something change in his expression as he processed what Thomas was saying. "She didn't tell you?" Thomas's voice dripped false sympathy. "Poor Sarah, always so secretive about her past. Tell him, dear. Tell him how you murdered my brother." "That's not what happened," Sarah said desperately. But she could see doubt creeping into Jacob's eyes. "Isn't it?" Thomas pulled another paper from his jacket. "This is the coroner's report. Death by gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range. This is the sheriff's initial report, stating that you were the only other person in the house at the time of death." Jacob's hand fell away from his gun as he stared at Sarah. She could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd come to care for with the accusations Thomas was making. "You ran," Jacob said quietly, and it wasn't quite a question. "I had to," Sarah whispered. "You don't understand." "She ran," Thomas confirmed, "because she's guilty, because she killed my brother in cold blood and fled like the criminal she is." "That's a lie." Sarah's voice cracked with desperation. "William was drunk. He was violent, he had a gun, and he was— "Careful, darling," Thomas interrupted smoothly. "Anything you say might be used against you in court. Though I'm prepared to be merciful, come home with me tonight, and we can discuss alternative arrangements to your legal troubles." The threat was clear, and Sarah felt bile rise in her throat. Thomas had always wanted her, had made his intentions known even while William was alive. Now he was using her husband's death as leverage to get what he'd always been denied. "Self-defense isn't murder," Jacob said slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "Is that what she told you?" Thomas laughed. "Self-defense? My brother was shot in the back, Mr. Donovan. Hardly the action of a woman defending herself." The lie hit Sarah like a slap. "That's not true. William was facing me when the gun went off. He was trying to— To what?" Jacob's voice was carefully neutral, but Sarah could hear the doubt underneath. This was it then. The moment she'd been dreading since she'd first looked into Jacob's kind eyes. The moment when the truth would destroy whatever fragile trust they'd built between them. "He was trying to rape me," Sarah said quietly, the words falling into the silence like stones into still water. "He'd been drinking for days, gambling away money we didn't have. When I tried to stop him from going out again, he became violent. He pushed me down, started tearing at my clothes. I managed to grab his gun, and when he came at me again—" She couldn't finish. Couldn't describe the terror of that moment, the desperate struggle, the way the gun had gone off almost by accident as they fought for control of it. "She shot him while he was walking away," Thomas said smoothly. "Shot him in the back like a coward. The trajectory of the bullet proves it." "You're lying," Sarah breathed. "Am I? Then why did you run instead of going to the authorities? Why did you steal money from my brother's personal effects before fleeing in the night?" "I took what was mine, what I needed to survive." "You took what belonged to the Garrett family," Thomas corrected. "You're a thief as well as a murderer." Jacob was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was like gravel. "Is it true? Did you kill your husband?" The question hung between them like a blade. Sarah looked into Jacob's blue eyes and saw everything she'd feared: doubt, disappointment, the slow death of whatever feelings he'd harbored for her. "Yes," she whispered. "I killed him." The admission seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Thomas's smile was triumphant, while his hired guns relaxed slightly, sensing that the fight had gone out of their opposition. "There," Thomas said with satisfaction. "The truth at last. Now, Sarah, gather your things. We have a long journey ahead of us." But Jacob hadn't moved. If anything, he seemed to be thinking harder, weighing something in his mind. "You said the bullet trajectory proves she shot him in the back," he said to Thomas. "That's correct. But you also said she was the only witness. So how exactly did you determine the trajectory? Was there an investigation? A trial?" Thomas's confident expression flickered slightly. "The evidence was clear enough." "Was there an investigation?" Jacob's voice had gone deadly quiet. "The local sheriff. The local sheriff who works for the Garrett family, the one whose salary you pay?" Jacob took a step forward. "Funny how evidence can be made to say whatever you want it to say when you own the people interpreting it." Sarah's heart leaped with desperate hope. Did Jacob believe her? Was he willing to fight for her after all? But Thomas wasn't finished playing his cards. "Believe what you want, Cowboy," he said with a shrug. "But I have a warrant for her arrest, signed by a federal judge. Sarah McKenna, or should I say Sarah Garrett, is coming with me tonight, one way or another." The federal warrant changed everything, and Sarah saw Jacob's expression shift as the legal reality of the situation settled over him. "Let me see it," he said quietly. Thomas produced the document with obvious satisfaction, and Jacob read it carefully while Sarah's world crumbled around her. A federal warrant meant Thomas had connections that reached far beyond local corruption. It meant that no matter how fast or how far she ran, the law would eventually catch up with her. "It's legitimate," Jacob said finally, his voice flat. "Of course it is," Thomas replied smoothly. "I told you I have excellent lawyers. Now, if you're quite finished playing hero, I'd like to collect my sister-in-law and be on our way." Jacob folded the warrant and handed it back, his movements deliberate and controlled. "You can have her," he said. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She staggered backward, feeling like the ground had just opened beneath her feet. She'd known this moment would come, had prepared herself for it, but hearing Jacob's quiet surrender still felt like dying. "Jacob," she whispered, but he wouldn't meet her eyes. "Excellent choice," Thomas said, his satisfaction evident. "I knew you were a reasonable man. Sarah, dear, fetch your things. We'll be traveling through the night." Sarah looked at Jacob one last time, memorizing his face, storing away the brief happiness she'd found here like a treasure to sustain her through whatever darkness lay ahead. "I'll get my bag," she said quietly. But as she turned toward her cabin, Jacob's voice stopped her cold. "Course, there's something you ought to know about federal warrants, Garrett." Thomas's eyebrows rose. "Oh? They have to be served by a federal marshal. You got a marshal with you?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Thomas's confident expression flickered, and Sarah saw uncertainty creep into his pale eyes. "I have authority to do what exactly?" Jacob's voice was deceptively mild. "You got a piece of paper that says Sarah Garrett is wanted for questioning in connection with her husband's death. Doesn't say anything about citizen's arrest. Doesn't give you authority to take her anywhere." Sarah's heart began to beat faster. Was Jacob looking for a way to fight this? Was he buying time? The warrant states that she's wanted for questioning," Jacob interrupted. "Doesn't say she's under arrest. Doesn't say she can't post bail or retain counsel. Just says the federal government would like to have a conversation with her." Thomas's mask was slipping now, revealing the cold fury beneath. "Don't try to lawyer your way out of this, Donovan. That woman is coming with me." "Maybe," Jacob agreed, "but not tonight, and not without proper legal representation. You can't stop me from taking what's mine." "She's not yours." Jacob's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried such menace that Thomas's hired guns shifted nervously. "She's not property to be owned or collected. She's a free woman on my land, and unless you've got a federal marshal with proper authority, you're not taking her anywhere." The standoff stretched taut again, but this time Sarah could see that the dynamics had shifted. Thomas had overplayed his hand, had assumed that the warrant would be enough to intimidate Jacob into compliance. Instead, he'd revealed the limitations of his legal authority. "This isn't over," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with frustrated rage. "No," Jacob agreed. "It's not, but it's over for tonight." Thomas stared at Sarah with eyes like chips of ice. "You can't run forever, darling. And when you finally face justice for what you've done, remember that I offered you mercy. The only thing you offered was slavery dressed up as protection," Sarah replied, finding her voice at last. "I'd rather face a judge than live as your prisoner." Thomas's face went white with fury, but before he could respond, Jacob stepped forward. "Time for you to leave," he said quietly. "You're not welcome here." For a moment, Sarah thought Thomas might order his men to fight. The hired guns looked ready for violence, hands hovering near their weapons. But Thomas was too calculating to risk a gunfight he might not win, especially over something that could be handled through legal channels. "We'll be back," he promised, "with proper authority next time." "You do that," Jacob replied. "But next time, make sure you bring a real marshal, and make sure your paperwork's in order. I've got lawyers too, and they don't take kindly to kidnapping attempts." Thomas mounted his horse with jerky, angry movements, his hired guns following suit. As they rode away into the darkness, Sarah felt her knees give out. Jacob caught her before she could fall, his strong arms wrapping around her like a shield against the world. "It's all right," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe. I've got you." But even as Sarah let herself lean into his strength, she knew that safety was an illusion. Thomas would be back, probably with the proper legal authority Jacob had demanded. When he came again, there would be no technicalities to hide behind, no legal loopholes to exploit. She'd bought herself time, nothing more. And when that time ran out, she'd have to face the consequences of that terrible night in Chicago, when her world had collapsed in gunfire and blood. "What happens now?" she asked against Jacob's chest. His arms tightened around her. "Now we fight." The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of legal preparation and quiet desperation. Jacob hired the best lawyer money could buy, a fierce woman named Catherine Walsh, who'd made her reputation defending cases others considered hopeless. They spent long hours in Cobb's study, going over every detail of that night in Chicago, building a defense strategy that relied as much on exposing Thomas Garrett's character as it did on proving Sarah's innocence. True to his word, Thomas returned with proper federal authority, a grim-faced marshal who served the warrant with professional courtesy and genuine regret. But instead of dragging Sarah away in chains, he agreed to let her remain at the ranch pending trial, provided she surrendered her passport and posted bond. Jacob paid the bond without hesitation, despite the astronomical sum. When Sarah protested, he simply said, "What good is money if you can't use it to protect the people you love?" The admission hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Too much had changed. Too many truths had been revealed for them to simply pick up where they'd left off. But something had shifted that night when Jacob had chosen to fight for her instead of surrendering to the inevitable. The trial, when it finally came, was a brutal affair that laid bare the worst moments of Sarah's marriage. Thomas had indeed corrupted the initial investigation, had bribed officials and manipulated evidence to support his version of events. But Catherine Walsh was a formidable opponent, and she systematically dismantled his case with the precision of a surgeon. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than either version they'd been telling. William Garrett had indeed been facing Sarah when the gun went off, had indeed been trying to force himself on her. But the bullet had struck him in the side, not the back, and he'd lived long enough to stumble away before collapsing. Thomas had used the position of the body to craft his lie about being shot while retreating. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of justifiable homicide. Sarah was free, not just legally, but truly free, for the first time since William Garrett had made her his wife. Standing on the courthouse steps in the autumn sunshine, with Jacob's hand warm and steady in hers, Sarah felt like she could finally breathe again. "What now?" she asked, echoing the question she'd posed that terrible night when Thomas had first found her. "Now," Jacob said, his blue eyes warm with promise, "we go home." Home. The word still had the power to make her heart skip, but now it carried different weight. Not the desperate hope of a woman with nowhere else to go, but the quiet certainty of someone who'd found where she belonged. They were married 3 months later, in a simple ceremony in the parlor she'd so carefully restored. The guest list was small. Ranch hands and neighbors, Catherine Walsh and the minister, a handful of friends who'd stood by them through the trial. But the love that filled that room was vast as the Montana sky. Jacob's wedding gift to her was a revised deed to the ranch. their names written together in permanent ink, a partnership that went deeper than law or custom. Sarah's gift to him was harder to define but no less precious. The gradual healing of trust, the slow rebuilding of a heart that had been shattered by loss and betrayal. They never spoke of Thomas Garrett again, though Jacob kept informed of his whereabouts through discreet inquiries. The man had returned to Chicago in disgrace, his political connections severed, and his reputation in ruins. He would trouble them no more. Life on the Lazy D settled into new rhythms. Sarah expanded the garden and started a small school for the children of neighboring ranches. Jacob built her a library where she could pursue the education that had been interrupted by marriage and tragedy. Together, they began to fill the house with the laughter and warmth it had been designed for. And when their first child was born, a daughter with Jacob's blue eyes and Sarah's stubborn chin, Sarah finally understood what her mother had meant about making a house into a home. It wasn't about keeping things clean or cooking perfect meals, though those mattered. It was about creating a place where love could take root and grow, where people felt safe enough to show their true selves, where the future felt possible instead of frightening. The past would always be part of her story, but it no longer defined her future. She was Sarah Donovan now, wife and mother, teacher and partner. She was home. Sometimes in the quiet moments before dawn when she stood at her kitchen window watching the sun rise over the mountains, Sarah thought about the desperate woman who'd tried to buy bread with her last penny. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone she'd once known but had grown beyond. Love, she'd discovered, was not about being saved or rescued. It was about finding someone brave enough to stand beside you while you saved yourself, someone willing to believe in your strength even when you'd forgotten you had any. Jacob had given her that gift, and in return, she'd given him something equally precious, the chance to love again, to build something lasting from the ashes of loss. Their story had begun with bread and desperation, but it would be written in years of shared sunsets, in children's laughter echoing through rooms once silent with grief, in the quiet satisfaction of a life built on trust and mutual respect. And sometimes, late at night when the wind whispered across the plains, Sarah would remember that terrible moment when she'd thought all was lost. She'd remember Jacob's voice saying, "Now we fight," and she'd smile in the darkness, grateful beyond words for a man who'd taught her that some things were worth fighting for. Thanks for staying with me through this incredible journey across the wild frontier of love and redemption. If this story touched your heart, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe for more tales of courage and romance. Drop a comment below sharing your favorite moment from Sarah and Jacob's story. I love hearing from fellow lovers of the Old West. Until our next adventure together, may your own love story be filled with the kind of courage that conquers all odds.